So welcome to the second class of the Heidegger and Plato course. So I did bombard you with a brief polemic about the entire history of thought, poetic and philosophic last week. So if you have any responses or questions about anything from that handout or the discussion around it, I'll just repeat a couple of the simplest points motivating our study of the essay. The first is that our intellectual authorities are now what I would characterize as postmodern. We don't believe in the truth, that there is a truth accessible to the human mind. And that's why we talk about identity and not principles. We talk about values and not principles, right? Because those are things that are not accessible to rational thought. They are creations or they are historical happenstance and so on. Now, perhaps all that's true, but this is where we are. And one key step in our accepting that is that the entire tradition of thought up to and including Hegel is wrong, that there is an objective truth graspable by the human mind. And that tradition in its classical form was begun by Plato, and the people who champion postmodern thought recognize this because their central target intellectually is Plato and Platonism. But we don't get the only really comprehensive critique of Plato and Platonism is given to us by Heidegger, and in this essay and another, and in an unpublished book that, well, it wasn't published in his lifetime, on the Sophists and a few other places. But if you read, say, for example, Derrida on Plato's Phaedrus, in the middle, one of the middle paragraphs, he'll just make the comment, the history of Western metaphysics as the interpretation of being as presence and so on. That's just he's just assuming that Heidegger's understanding is correct. And so we, for our own purposes, if we're going to evaluate where we are, need to have an independent look at this critique. So that's one motivation. Yeah, were there any thoughts or questions about the other material we covered last week? Okay, so in that case, we'll make our way into the cave. I will introduce some more of the context of the discussion of the cave later, but I think the main thing now is that we make our way as far as we can into the essay. And I'm going to read the first part of his translation. So he says, imagine this. People live under the earth in a cave-like dwelling, stretching a long way up toward the daylight is its entrance, towards which the entire cave is gathered. That's an interpretation. What it actually says is that it has a long opening all along the cave. So what Plato is intimating is that in principle, all human beings have whatever access to the truth, we all have it potentially. Heidegger has a different interpretation where he's changing the meaning somewhat. The people have been in this dwelling since childhood, shackled by the legs and neck. For this reason, they also stay in the same place so that the only thing for them to look at is whatever they encounter in front of their faces. But because they are shackled, they are unable to turn their heads around. Some light, of course, is allowed them, namely from a fire that casts its glow towards them from behind them, being above and at some distance. Between the fire and those who are shackled, therefore behind their backs, there runs a walkway at a certain height. Imagine that a low wall has been built the length of the walkway, like the low curtain that puppeteers put up over which they show their puppets. And Glaucon says, I see. Now, when Heidegger translates, imagine this, and he begins the next paragraph too. Imagine that along the wall there are people carrying all sorts of things that reach up over the wall like puppeteers. Statues and carvings made of stone and wood and many other artifacts that people have made. As you would expect, some of the people carrying things talk to each other and some are silent. So he is saying, imagine. Now, in the Greek, it's just the word for see. But imagine's a good way of translating it, because what Socrates is saying is, I want you to see an image. And then we're going to, but the purpose of the image is to see what the image is an image of. Does it make sense? That's as I just very briefly mentioned last time, there are these three central images in the Republic of the sun, of a divided line, and the cave, and they're all about the relation between image and original. Okay, so the next, and in that second paragraph where he refers to the artifacts. So,
Martin, sorry,
yeah.
The German actually says, bring it into your sight. And then the next paragraph is, bring also into your look, into your sight. So it's not imagining, he's asking them to build a picture, to make a picture in their mind.
That's good. That's good. I've got the German here. Actually, I didn't know. I should have checked more closely. Yeah, that's better. That's better. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, in either case, the sight, as images are to the sight, so the beings are to the mind. That's an analogy that is constant in Plato. That the sensual things can be likened to an image of the being, which is only graspable by the mind. So, for example, you see many human beings, you instantly recognize this is a human being, and that's a rock or a tree or an artifact or whatever. And so there is some active reception of what something is that's prior to any of your thoughts about the character of that person, say. Now, you see with the senses this human being, but there must be an act of the mind by which you differentiate that human being from a tree. And it's that act of the mind, the perception of what something is, that Plato regularly refers to as seeing the form of the idea or eidos of a thing. Okay, so in that second paragraph, so we have the wall behind the prisoners. And we have thus far been told that this has something to do with human nature. Now, Heidegger doesn't cite this until the very beginning of his interpretation, but I'll read it now. So he says, the cave-like abode is the image for you could say our abode, revealed to sight as we look around. Sorry, it's slightly further on, but he starts this translation at the second line of the text. The first line is, consider this likeness of our nature, human nature, in its education and lack of education. So it's about human nature, and a cave is a natural phenomenon. But we are introduced to artifacts immediately with the war and the people carrying artifacts and making sounds to go along with them. So our natural perception, our ordinary perception, is made up of the vision of shadows that are given off by a light, and this is a light inside the cave. So does that mean it's been produced like the artifacts? Yeah, but the shadows of artifacts. So the reflections of man, human-made things. And this is in some sense, another depiction of Socrates' departure from pre-Socratic philosophy. You can't just step from our ordinary human world into a straight and direct perception of the things that are natural, the natural elements or whatever it is, because all thinking occurs initially within a particular language, and that language is a construction, and the paradigms of thought within you, which you develop your thoughts, are particular, and they're artifacts. Okay, so the next line of the translation is, Glaucon says, "This is an unusual picture, or a strange picture, an out-of-place picture that you are presenting here, and these are strange prisoners." And Socrates' reply to that is, they're like us, right? So just to reinforce what I was suggesting before about when he's saying, see this and see that, he's saying this is an image, which is a likeness of our actual reality. And all images abstract from and intensify certain aspects of experience in order to illuminate it. Okay. Now, just one more point on this page. Socrates says, now, if they were able to say something about what they saw and to talk it over, do you not think that they would regard that which they saw on the wall as beings? So ta onta, just the things that genuinely are. So we initially take whatever it is that we are taught to be the truth. And in the image, we take the reflection cast by the shadows of artifacts as the beings. And if this was the Greek world, then what are the highest beings? So that's the gods. Right. So Homer and Hesiod tell mythoi, stories, which characterize the gods, and that's their construction, their artifact, and then it reaches people through recitation and other means of transmission, and that's the vision of the shadows. Now, on page 159, in the second paragraph, and Margarita, you can tell me if this doesn't do justice to the German, because I can't find my copy. But Socrates says, "So now," I replied, "watch the process whereby the prisoners are set free from their chains, and along with that, cured of their lack of insight." Now, what Socrates says, it's very slightly different in the Greek. He says, examine the release and healing from the bonds and lack of intelligence. Such, the release and the healing, such as might occur by nature. Right? So there's a natural possibility for education. It doesn't refer to immediately to more than one person in the way that just the English translation of Heidegger suggests. And the English translation of Heidegger suggests that what's the process? Now, this is going to be very important for Heidegger's suggestion about the genuine teaching of this section of Plato, which is that there's a change in our understanding of truth that's reflected by Plato's teaching, even though he's not fully aware of it. But so, and it's very important for Heidegger that that it is this process of coming to understand that's one of the key aspects of this teaching. It's not a static teaching, but I don't know where he gets the word process from, because
No, he says in welche Art. I mean, in what way, in what kind of
okay, thank you. That's much closer. That's much closer to the Greek, and that's helpful. But does he mention nature at all in that sentence?
No.
Yeah. Okay, I will do my philological due diligence and go through the German for next time. Okay, but for Plato, this is the key, that human beings are embedded in artifacts. We would call that culture. Right? Our understanding is fully imbued with our particular circumstance, language, history, structure, and so on. But the truth by nature is still, in principle, accessible to us. And that's what he means by education, that a genuine education is that which ascends from the particular interpretation of things provided by your community towards the truth. And Heidi's going to say there is no such ascent, that's a misunderstanding. Now, so that's why Socrates uses this word by nature. So in this completely artificial situation where all of the illumination that we have is given us nurture, not nature, there is a natural occurrence that allows us to see things, and it recurs in both immediately and slowly. The immediate, and he uses a word that means instantaneous or suddenly. He says, Socrates says this in the second paragraph on 159. Whenever any of them was unchained and was forced to stand up suddenly, instantaneously, to turn around, to walk, and to look up toward the light, in each case, the person would be able to do this only with pain. And because of the flickering brightness, he would be unable to look at those things, his shadows he saw before. So looking towards the internal light of the cave, he's unable to see the artifacts that produce the shadows that he takes to be the true things. And this process that's being described is something that's depicted continually in the Platonic dialogues. What people say about things, the conventional opinions, has some inner tension that Socrates brings out, and they're unable to reject either side. And so they have several different recourses. One is just to insist that they're right and to give up the conversation, which various of the people who he discusses do. Others are to but some also follow, and they're prepared to reject some of the things that one of their convictions. Okay, but there is the need on the one hand of the instantaneous insight, and then there's the hard work of allowing one's eyes to adjust to the light and making one's way up to the outside. Yeah. Does anyone have any suggestions or questions as I go through? Please interrupt. I'm just going to pick out some of the aspects of this, and then we can start to read Heidegger's.
Martin, I have a comment.
Please.
And this relates to where it says, whenever any of them was unchained and forced to stand up suddenly to turn around to walk. If these people have been sitting down all of their lives and they were suddenly told to stand up physically and walk, even that in physical terms would be something difficult and painful for them, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah, I think that's...
This just isn't a mental difficulty. This is a physical ordeal.
Well, so the whole thing is an image put into physical terms of a mental experience. Yeah. So
Okay.
precisely as you say, though, the physical pain, and he refers to the physical pain of looking towards the light inside the cave, you would also have the pains that you refer to of, the stiffness of the limbs and so on. And so all of these things, the artifacts, everything is a sensual image of the reality that we're trying to understand. And so they all have their correlative to that. And so the pain that you're referring to, and the pain of the eyes adjusting and so on, is the pain of having to discard thought that is, or instinct, things that are now instinctive with you, that began as things you were taught or raised in, and having to question those.
But this is a complete difficult situation, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, and it's also somewhat one-sided. There are a number of passages in Plato where he discusses an ascent towards the truth of things, and in the dialogues on which start from human desire or eros, in those cases, the ascent is accompanied, by pleasure or satisfaction and longing. Whereas in this one, it's almost, it's much more harsh. But that's
it's not just an abstract ordeal. It's everything. It's a physical ordeal, and also this person is leaving everything they've ever known in their whole life.
That's right. That's right. And I think that we underestimate, we have a fairly sort of easygoing relativism, or, I mentioned that our teaching now, our political teaching, is that you're not allowed to distinguish between better and worse ways of life. That's, for example, John Rawls, the most influential political philosophy book of the last 50 or 60 years, which begins from the point of view that you can't judge different ways of life. Now, that seems to provide a solution to everything, because now we don't have to argue. But what it means is that you're telling people not to be attached to their own life, not to be attached to what is most important in their own life, which is what they think is good and what's bad, noble, base, beautiful, ugly, and so on. Because those are the things that give your life its significance. You bet your life on your answer to those questions. And I think some of our teaching undercuts that. And that's why we have this sort of apparent coolness and detachment from one's own beliefs or opinions or convictions. But it's only apparent. Beneath that, that's why we have lots of anxiety and so on, I think, because we're taught not to take things seriously, which determine directly the character of our experience.
Martin, just to pick up on what Dennis first said.
Yeah.
Go back to page 1, when Socrates says that these people, they are very much like us humans. My reaction was Glaucon should have pushed back against that. And the tension for me is Socrates proposing a sort of anthropological, psychological analysis of human behavior, which he expects us to accept in order to detail, and then go on to explain the process of coming to the truth? Or is he simply putting up a story for illustrative purposes? And he expects us to accept the story simply as a mechanism to explain his theory. I'm not sure what's the right way to take it. If I'd been Glaucon, I would say, well, hang on a minute, I'm not sure I agree that those people in the cave are like people generally.
And what would be what's the main reaction that you have against it that would make you want to push back?
Well, he can write the story in a way that makes it impossible for people to move up the scale of perception and of knowledge. And so, he's writing the story, he's telling the story, he's creating the plot, he's eliminating, by virtue of the way he writes the story, the possibility for people to, in fact, break free of the cultural and social things that limit their ability to move beyond a particular perception of reality.
Maybe the English is again doing something here, because when he says in the German, they
Can't
are.
quite hear, Margarita.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I not? No, is that all right? Can you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just soft voice.
Yeah. He says, sie gleichen aber ganz uns Menschen. They are exactly like us humans. They are exactly. Mensch is, people.
Yeah, but that is
What does
actually
Plato say? What does the Greek say?
Yes.
homoios hermein. So he just says they're like us. He doesn't actually say anything about human beings. Although that's what,
Like us, what? Yeah.
yeah, that's what it's about. But yeah, it's just two words, homoios, hermein. They're like us. They're of the same sort. They're like, yeah, a likeness of us.
The point is they're not gods.
Yeah, that's what I thought, that it was like the point is that they come from a point of ignorance and so do we, and it changes as it goes on, and they progress like we do. That's how I understood it, that we all start from a point of ignorance, even if you look at it like from when you're a baby to a toddler to a child.
Yeah, so the word for education is in Greek it's paideia, and it's got the word for child in it. So it's the process of maturing out of childhood. And you notice that one of the things that distinguishes human beings, even when they're children, is that they can distinguish between image and reality. So whereas, for example, a couple of years ago, we bought a kitten, and the first time it saw itself in a mirror, it reacted as if there was a cat. And then after that, never paid any attention to any mirror ever again. And animals are either seem to be confused or just ignore images because they can't see an image as an image. They don't look at something and say, that's me in the water, reflected in the water.
But I think that's applicable for us as well at any stage. I mean, I know more than I did when I was a baby, but coming into this course, I knew nothing at all. So we're always coming from a position of ignorance with something. That's how we progress, is to work our way out of that ignorance.
Absolutely, yeah.
But aren't Plato and Heidegger sort of falling into the very trap they're describing? Is the allegory of the cave, is Heidegger's translation of it a relatively true or false image of human behavior, of the reality of human behavior? Because the whole discussion is founded on the allegory and we proceed to interpret it. But what if the allegory is itself a shadow on the wall?
It is.
And to the reality.
Okay, now, it could be a completely distorted image of human life. But one thing that is clear, and that's what I'm trying to suggest by pointing out that he says, see this and so on, is that he's deliberately deploying an image that is meant to be a reflection of reality. So he's not saying this is the only picture. He's saying this is a picture which brings out some aspect of our humanity, of our experience. And he has very different pictures in other dialogues. And so part of the teaching is that there's no systematic full account of the whole of human experience. You can only reflect through images certain aspects of it. But if we work through that, we hopefully gain some insight into what the truth is. That's how I'd summarize how he's deploying it. But I mean, if we find the image unpersuasive, then that's a different thing. We can completely disagree, and that's yeah.
The point that bothers me about the allegory so far, I think, I mean, I can work with the fact that it's an allegory, but even with the facts presented to us, you know, they're chained and they're restricted in movement, and all they can see is the shadows. Is that, for me, it just doesn't do away with the latent ability to know truth without that 4-step process. People are aware, and that they can just innately know that what they see on the wall are but shadows, and that there's a reality more unhidden than that, even before they start the 4-step process. That's for me, and I can accept that it's an allegory and that all this sort of stuff, but just that's what I'm struggling with at this stage. And I suppose, just to piggyback off what Michael was saying, and that's what doesn't ring true for me at this stage. It seems that whilst it denies that people can't know unless they go through this four-stage process, the way that it's set up in reality is that people do have this latent ability to know truth, even if they remain chained and looking at the shadows their whole life.
That I'm not so sure about, because I mean, just the power of collective opinion seems to me, and this is increasingly true as the decades passed, very, very strong.
Yeah,
Much stronger than I initially thought. When I was like a couple of decades ago, I would much more strongly agree with you.
it does come down. I mean, we haven't explored it yet, and I'm just shooting from the hip, but I think it does go just to the nature of being itself, and you know, what is the starting point in our understanding of all of that. I haven't developed it very clearly, and I don't mean to be facetious, but I imagine the allegory, and if you're chained looking at these shadows, and I don't mean to be facetious, you can literally see your own nose. You can see your nose, and from that, you can then develop thoughts and ideas, and the fact that they're chained means that, you know, implies that they can move and that they have to be chained. And then the fact that they do move means that they can perceive things other than the shadows and have a sense of reality other than the shadows. And that's not so much about the allegory. It's about what is the starting point for our ability to know truth. And I don't think the allegory achieves that in terms of, well, it's just what we can see as the shadows. And that's where I come back to, I think, part of Michael's point about, you know, how we regard this allegory. Sorry, I've gone on a bit too long.
No,
Can I just add to that something?
Yeah.
Just surely shadows are a part of reality, or reality in their own accord. I mean, why is this distinction? If you walk outside and there's a shadow following you, that shadow is real. What's the big problem here? There's nothing false about it. Shadows do exist.
But that's only if you know it's a shadow. If it's a shadow of a person, the distinction is it doesn't represent a person. It's not an actual person. It's just the same shape as a person. So that's...
It's a shadow of a person.
Yeah, literally.
It's unreal.
No. It's a real shadow, but it's not a real person.
Yeah.
This is part of the complication of what an image is. An image is both what it is, an image, or a shadow, a reflection, and it's an image of something else. It has a complicated way of being.
But it's real. Images are real.
They are. They are a real thing. But for example, okay, so what he's attempting to suggest, and possibly entirely wrongly, but what he's attempting to suggest is that those images on the cave wall are reflections of artifacts. That's the key: nature versus construction. So are the things that we discuss that loom in our horizon, loom large in our horizon, what is their character? And he is saying that always, already, they're images. So they're real, but they're fictions. They're not the truth. But to come back to Stephen's point, he's attempting to, he gives a story in time and place of what is not in time and place. So you're freed instantaneously, and you have to work your way out outside to see the genuine things. Now, that temporal journey is actually a reflection of the fact that always we are potentially able to glimpse the truth, and whilst we're in a particular time and place where we speak a particular language and so on and so forth, that has to be true all the time. But he puts into time and place a journey as if you can separate part of yourself. Yeah. But I think it has that meaning that you would prefer it had, which is that the truth is always in principle accessible. But here, I mean, these are 3 images of wisdom, and the cave is the most extended discussion of the difference between living in the light of opinion only and being wise about the nature of things. And so it's part of a longer argument in which he's saying, if you're going to rule justly, you would have to know the nature of things and not just the opinions of within the city. I just mentioned that context. And
Martin, I take it he's not saying the images are utterly false. They're a part only of the reality, a dimension only of the reality.
Well, this is the interesting thing, because the people
Very closer to the truth.
So it's possible that the artifacts are complete constructions that have little relation to reality, or it's possible that they are the constructions of people who've been out, to use the metaphor, who've been outside the cave and make constructions that are more or less close to the genuine nature of things.
Martin, there are several things that come to my mind here. Is that, say, these people, the puppeteers, have been out into the sun, they can see a real horse galloping in the paddock. They go into the cave and they make a puppet of a horse. So it's not even a real horse that's casting the shadow. So the people seeing the shadows are seeing several degrees away from reality. They're seeing the puppeteer's interpretation of a real horse. They're seeing the shadow of the puppeteer's interpretation of a real horse,
Right.
and how much with the material the puppeteers have and how much the puppeteers want to convey. So what the people are seeing in the shadows on the wall of the cave is a long way away from a real horse galloping in a field.
Right.
Sorry, but how do we know it was a real horse galloping in a field?
We have to go out of the cave into the sunshine.
No, I get that. We out there and we looking at something and assuming that's a real horse. On what grounds?
Because there's not much between us and the horse for our interpretation, but when we're chained in the cave, there are degrees of interpretation and impression between us and a real horse. We may misinterpret a real horse when we see it, but when we're chained in the cave and seeing a shadow of a puppet of a real horse, we're a long, long way. We've got a lot of possibilities to misinterpret what a horse actually is.
It's like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, and it gets less and less.
That's a technological version of what I'm trying to say.
Can I make a suggestion? Martin?
Yeah, please.
Oh, yeah. So my suggestion is that, for example, with say something like a tree, we all know what a tree is in our common sense understanding, but only a botanist who's studied trees and plants for years can give a scientific account of a tree. And in a sense, in a strong sense, the scientific account of the botanist is superior to the one that we have as laymen. Similarly, we all have an understanding of the economy from everyday life, buy and sell stuff, we invest and so on. But an economist who's studied for years the economy, he can give a macro picture and with details of demand and so on. And whether the economist is a Marxist or a social or the opposite, their understandings are much more sophisticated than those of us who are laymen, non-economists. And similarly with a religious person, their view, in everyday life, they look at a tree and the earth and the sky, and it just means the same as everybody else. But as a pastor who's been reading the Bible and theology books for decades, he's got an understanding of them which is very different, and he'll, as a religious person, he thinks it's superior to his understanding of these things from the secular, everyday common sense world. So in a way, these shadows, I think of the shadows as being perfectly valid because they are the exact shape of the things that are presented by the puppet masters. So they are the same shape. And the source of the knowledge, the creation of the shadow is from the fire, but ultimately from the sun outside. So it's not as if the shadow is false, but it's extremely partial. So I don't think of it so much as being false and true, but, very partially true, the shadow, more true, the next level, as somebody was saying earlier. So it's sort of levels of truth rather than purely truth versus falsehood.
There's a danger of torturing the allegory, isn't there? It's like a parable.
Yeah, there is. And there are.
I mean, this is his method. Perhaps I'm guilty of it. I started it. We can torture it too much.
No, but
use it to develop his ideas.
No, but it's a common thing for as long as I can remember. People say, that's a metaphor, or I'm speaking just figuratively. But it's so often figures, and in particular the strongest trope, strongest figure is a metaphor, and these are how new insights are created, through metaphors and allegories and other sorts of tropes, including in science, I think.
The difficulty I have though with is your much greater admiration for economists. He's referring there to that because that is an understanding of a communal activity more or less accurate. That's not. There's no. Is there a nature of that? Now, when the people go outside the cave, it's a silent viewing of the things. So one way of understanding the whole thing is as a metaphor for two aspects of our thinking. There is a silent, that is languageless, language being a convention. We carve up the world differently in different languages, which leads many people to say that therefore the truth is relative to the language. What Plato argues in various places is that prior to expressing something or forcing something into language, or in this case, building an image of it so that people can see a reflection of it, there is a reception of what things are. And that's the nature of those things. It's within language, there are many things that we argue about that have no such natural being, the economy being one. So I'm not sure if it's so easily mapped onto and just an assent in knowledge. Because one thing that's very striking about this, which Heidegger doesn't bring out, and I think because he wants to criticize it, is that Plato is suggesting that very few people make it outside the cave, right? And there is no possibility of the people living in the light outside the cave. So our genuine education cuts against our being part of the community in our most fundamental orientation. And the reason this, he uses this, Socrates uses this image to say, here's the third image for what the difference is between wisdom and want of insight. And he's doing that in order to say, well, we want people who have insight to run the city because only they can do it justly. Now, the part of the point of this image is to say that in our fundamental orientation, we are happiest by seeing the truth of things. And this is an argument he makes throughout the dialogues, that the most necessary and pleasant thing is to try and understand the truth for human beings. Whether or not we find that persuasive, that's part of what he's teaching. Okay. So
I think that's right, Martin, and I think if we look at what Socrates shows us from his life and what we know about him, is that he was in the marketplace, never wrote a thing, just talked to different people, and it seems that is what he actually did. And it sort of shows, and there are parts of the dialogues which show it too, that everybody, the bloke down at the pub, and Mrs. Smith down at the shop there, everyone wants the truth, and I think that from a Socratic point of view, everyone has the capacity to see the truth that they didn't see a little bit in the past, because Socrates has a discussion with a slave boy who didn't realize he knew so much about geometry and so forth. So I guess I'm a bit more sanguine perhaps than Plato, who thought only.
Yes, I think. Okay, so that's. I'm glad you've expressed that, because I take a different view, and now we've got both of these views accessible. So you and I both share the point of view that Plato was saying every human being. He expresses this mythologically in the Phaedrus. Every human soul has been outside the cosmos and seen the true beings, right? So, and then it goes into human form, meaning if you're a human being, you have potential access to the truth of things. So we agree on that. I think that though that it's very clear that, well, I'm suggesting that only a very few can use their capacities to the full, very, very few, and that the cave, that is the political community as a whole, will always be in tension with that person, and that's why he says, the return of the person to the community is characterized by. Let me just read the sentence.
They try to kill him.
Yeah, they try to kill him.
Very few can use or choose to use.
Well, both. And this is, I think the dialogues also show this, because there are people who start to talk with Socrates and get annoyed, abuse him, and leave. And there are people who start to talk with Socrates and fall silent, and so on and so forth. We have every variety of reaction to people who are shown that their deepest convictions are in tension with each other, and they have to reject part of them, or they have to, to be silent in the face of that is literally to be irrational, without logos, without speech, right? You're making an irrational resistance to a problem in your thought. And that happens to, we don't really have that many successful conversations in the dialogues for precisely this reason. And that's why, after this allegory is finished, Socrates at one point says to Glaucon, just within a page or two, he says, Glaucon, you're not going to have just rulers until you have people who don't want to rule. You can remember I read that passage last week from an earlier part of the dialogue where Socrates says, there won't be any rest from evils for the cities, nor for humankind, unless those natures, that is, people have natural inclinations, making their way towards political power on the one hand, and philosophy on the other, are compelled to go together. But what he means is that the normal situation is that some people are very much attracted to power and fame, and they will go into politics, and some people are attracted to the truth, and they will philosophize. But that's the natural situation. So it would be an unnatural situation to force these people, A, out of the cave, and then B, force them back into the cave to rule. So for that's why it's a very different political teaching in the classics, in Plato and Aristotle, which is that the normal situation is that you'll have irrational rulers who have a very partial understanding of the truth and who are partly out for their own good. And you can perhaps ameliorate the situation with certain institutions, but that's the way it is. Whereas we suffer from both too much optimism and consequently too much pessimism, I think. I mean, just philosophically, we have gone back in modernity, we have gone back and forth between those two situations, that we can cure, we can find a solution to our political ills, or that there is no solution. Okay, I got off topic there somewhat, but let me just read a passage from late in this discussion.
It's a good discussion, though, Martin.
And if anyone wants to say anything more about the cave image as Heidegger's translated here, we'll have that discussion, and then begin to start to read paragraphs from his essay, which will get us deeply into the thick of things. Okay, so I'm just going to read the paragraph on page 163, the first paragraph, where he's talking about the cave dwellers after this person has gone outside and their eyes have adjusted to the light and they can see the beings. And he says, however, if among the people in the previous dwelling place, namely in the cave, certain honors and commendations were established for whoever most clearly catches sight of what passes by, the things that happen every day, and also best remembers which of them normally is brought first, which ones later, and which ones at the same time, and for whoever then could most easily foresee which ones might come by next. Now that's a description of intelligence, but in the sense of astuteness, someone who's politically astute and can master the moment by organizing forces and understanding alliances and so on. Now, then he says, do you think that he, the one who had gotten out of the cave, would now still envy those in the cave and want to compete with those people there who are esteemed and who have power? Or would he not much rather wish upon himself the condition Homer speaks of? And then we have a quote, living on the land above ground as the paid menial of another destitute peasant. Now, that's Achilles in Hades, right? So he's comparing the political community and the life lived in competition for the rewards and honors that the political community gives. He's comparing that to Hades, and there's a small joke. Hades in Greek has the alpha privative, as in atheist or anaerobic and so on. The alpha, the A you put in front of a word to indicate without the following thing. So an atheist is someone without God. Anaerobic is someone who is exercising without the benefit of the chemical process using air, but rather producing lactic acid in the muscles or whatever. So Hades is alpha without idea, without looks, without ideas, without forms. So Hades is literally the invisible place, right? Because that's where people go. People leave life. They no longer, the Homeric term is someone alive. The Homeric term is looking upon the sun. So someone, and because things are visible in the light in life, and the Homeric term for where people go and they die is Hades, the invisible place. Right? But Socrates Plato makes use of this. And that's Achilles in Hades so Achilles dies for two reasons: eternal fame and because his friend died Patroclus, and he wants to revenge his friend, even though he knows that will lead to his own death. And then in Hades, he says, I would rather be a serf to a peasant than be king of all those in Hades. So that life itself has this value that he didn't give it before. Before, the eternal fame meant more to him than life. Okay. So then, yeah, Socrates continues, and will he not prefer to put up with absolutely anything else rather than associate himself with those opinions that hold in the cave and be that kind of human being? Now, as Heidegger brings out very well, part of this discussion, this image that Socrates produces, is that of blindness and adjusting to light and darkness. I want to suggest as we go along that Heidegger doesn't do quite enough justice to the two different processes, the ascent and the descent. I think he makes them too much the same, but he definitely brings helpful attention to them, to this fact. So the two are, the person who is dragged up out of the cave takes a long time for them to adjust to seeing things as they are. And the highest thing that provides the illumination for everything is the sun, which you can't look at directly without being blinded. Now that's actually an image that Socrates has just developed before he discusses the cave, of the highest principle of all things, which he calls the idea of the good, or just the good, or the condition of the good. He doesn't describe it precisely. And he says, I can't describe it precisely. Right. And we will look at that, a couple of sentences of his description of that image later. But that's the first kind of blindness, going outside and then the eyes adjusting and being able to see things for what they are. And he mentions things like plants, animals, human beings, no gods. They're the artifacts made by poets, which will carry them above the wall, right? Okay. Now, in the second last paragraph on 163, he said, we have the other kind of blindness. If he now once more had to engage with those who had remained shackled there in the business of asserting and maintaining opinions about the shadows, I just want to check what he said here. Yeah. Okay. While his eyes are still weak and before they have readjusted, an adjustment that would require quite a bit of time, would he not then be exposed to ridicule down there? And would they not let him know that he had gone up, but only in order to come back into the cave with his eyes ruined or corrupted? And so too, it certainly does not pay to go up. And if they could get hold of this person who takes it in hand to free them from their chains and to lead them up, and if they could kill him, would they not actually kill him? And Daquan says they certainly will. Now, as Heidegger points out, that's clearly a reference to Socrates' own fate. So Socrates is put on trial for corrupting the youth, not believing in the gods of the city, and introducing new demonic things. So that's almost exactly the same as saying disbelieving in the reflections on the wall that come from the images of the gods created by Homer and Hesiod, and instead substituting new artifacts that he carries behind the wall, whose reflection and that would be like in the Republic, for example, he spends 2 books replacing the gods with the forms. That's what Socrates does. He replaces the gods with the forms. And one of the meanings of that is, his constant attempts to argue that the most necessary life is that of philosophy, which is the recognition of one's ignorance and the need for the search for the truth. And the dialogues show us many occasions of this, of him not being able to being able to persuade people temporarily to be open to that discussion. There's one instance where he says so and so turn towards philosophy, and it's Polemicus from the Republic, and he says this in the Phaedrus. But there's not many other instances. The main instance we know about is Plato and Xenophon. So we know that they turn towards philosophy because they produce these philosophical works, although Xenophon still had a life of action. When Socrates died, he was actually in Persia with an army of Greek mercenaries. Okay. So yeah, we probably should have a break actually. So we'll just wait a couple of minutes and if there's anything further about just what we've touched on in Plato's Cave, and then when we come back, we'll begin to read some of Heidegger. But yeah, any further suggestions?
Sorry, go ahead. Yep.
I have a question. I can see in terms of the people in the cave wanting to kill someone who goes out and comes back, I can see that relative to Socrates and the mob in Athens. I want to know why the people in the cave have no interest in what might be outside if they're told it's better. Are they just stuck in their stuff, in a rut, or comfortable? It's too hard.
Well, yeah, I think, you brought out well before about the aspect of pain involved in the image. And so what's that a representation of? That's a representation of the great difficulty in genuinely being open-minded. Not in the how there is this superficial sense of being open-minded, of just saying, well, that's your truth and that's your truth, and there's meaning there is no truth, so we don't have to argue. That's easy, but that's not genuine. When you have genuine convictions, and to give them up is quite painful.
Okay, I get it. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question? A parallel that I saw, and I'm just wondering if anyone else saw, or if I'm totally off the mark. When it was talking about the pain of going out of the cave, I thought it was reflecting on life, and then you die, and that's the pain, and then you go to the afterlife, which is the new revelation out in the sunshine. And so as I was reading it, I was just, speculating in my head, is this where this is going? Which of course it wasn't. But then it said, and if someone came down or came in out of the sunlight, wouldn't they be put to death? And I thought, well, that's Jesus, isn't it? Like, he came down from heaven and was like not accepted and was put to death and ridiculed. What are the words? It's ridiculed as a not accepted at all. Did anyone else see any kind of parallel there, or am I just out on a limb?
I see a parallel there. I didn't until you mentioned it, though.
Yeah, likewise. Now you mention it, I can see the analogy.
And it fits that people are shackled there because they can't really get out of the cave without killing themselves, literally. So they are literally shackled by their life to not go to see the truth, or not able to, at least.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, everyone. I appreciate that.
You're a genius.
You clearly don't know me very well.
And it is interesting and this is a teaching of a number of Greek thinkers, that the founder of a way of life does tend to, has to destroy the last one, in a sense.
Pays for it.
And they often pay for it. Yeah. What has also changed, and this is that all of a sudden we're moving around in the cave, right? They'll get their hands on him and kill him. Right, so the metaphor has changed. He's changed the rules of the metaphor to illustrate some other aspect, and that's very frequent in Plato, and deliberate.
He's tortured his own allegory.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, should we have a 10-minute break? Come back at 7:20 and continue then. Right.
Thank you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, sorry, I just got to notice saying my microphone. Okay, so the next course is political philosophy, from the classics up till a little bit of Nietzsche, but mainly on the principles of democracy. So that's March, 5 sessions once per week.
Right.
And after that, I'm not quite sure exactly what we're going to do. We already have 2 courses set up in April, May, June, July, 6 weeks each, which is on on the first philosophers, the pre-Socratics, with some work on ancient Greek language.
That's what you did previously, didn't you?
Yes, and we did that at
Yes.
an enormously challenging rate over one 6-week period.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So now it's going to be 2 6-week periods up to Heraclitus, and then from Parmenides to Socrates in the second 6 weeks.
Right.
And there's a course on the good life in July during the school holidays, using the texts that also appear in the VCE course in the second semester of the year. But yeah, there are more courses coming which we haven't set in stone yet, just for administrative reasons, not being entirely clear on what we're doing.
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you. Yes. Something to look forward to.
You are on the email list?
Yes, of course.
Okay, good, because yeah, you should get notice of things coming up. But I'm open to suggestion about courses. So
Well, I'm a fan of Heidegger, and so it's so fascinating. So anything to do with him, you know.
what I am actually preparing a course, which I think I might do with the MSCP, just because it might be of interest, on his book Plato's Sophist.
Because you're probably aware, Andrew Benjamin did a long course over 12 weeks on the Heidegger essay about living and technology, you know, those 2 essays. And that was fabulous. Really interesting how much he was aware of the horrors of modern life, you know, of what we're doing.
Yeah.
So that was very, very good.
I just started reading the essay, The Thing, and he begins by saying, by commenting on how distance changed with technology, our notion of distance and time is completely changing. So, and it's alienating us from our own lives. And just think about, I mean, he was talking about the fact that there are newsreels and railroads and cars, but now just think of people using the word connection with regards to devices, but those connections that we have are actually separating us.
Yes.
Yeah.
That said, I'd rather not go back to, for example, pre-dental anesthesia.
Yes, I'm 100% with you.
There's some things about modern life I'm very happy with.
Yeah, absolutely.
You youngsters, you're wimps.
Yeah. We used to take
is there a general sort of introduction to classical philosophy? What's in the third row of boxes on your historical outline? Can you recommend something that's a good overview to? I know we should go back and read the originals, had we but world enough and time. But is there a good overview introduction you can recommend? Not on the spot.
Yeah, it's difficult and depends on your. Let's email about it, because I can get a better sense of what you're after, and because there are a lot of different orientations. I just thought I'd read something about a Platonic myth, and the image that we're reading is deliberately, I keep saying this, an image which is meant to teach us about, which has it's an image of the relation between reality and image. So it's not a myth so much, but this is a commentator called Jacob Klein in his commentary on the Meno, and he just says something about Platonic myth, which I think is helpful with regards to an allegory or an analogy. He says, are not myths, in Socrates' understandings, great luminous mirrors which throw reflected light on the condition and the predicament of human life, and are not mythical monsters always images of the soul itself, even though the ultimate source of that reflected light remains hidden? To know oneself means, among other things, to look at oneself and at one's actions in the mirrors with which those familiar and mostly dreadful myths have surrounded us. A myth provides some measure for our actions. Platonic dialogues are set to measure that measure, to try to find the right yardstick for this task, to try to find the source of that reflected light means to be engaged in philosophy. To combat the pernicious effect of a false yardstick, to combat the distortion which those mirrors produce, requires the setting up and telling of new myths. Myth telling is indeed the paradigm of all rhetorical art. It tends to initiate an effort in the soul of men and to beget action. It is in actions that human excellence and its opposite reveal themselves. A new myth, a Socratic Platonic myth, will always speak of the soul and will always be concerned about the undistorted whole, but its truth will not be found in its words. Okay, so I'm not sure if that's totally illuminating, but I appreciate it for its suggestion that Plato is explicitly telling you a new myth. He has Socrates say in the Republic, we're like figures in a myth telling myths to one another. Right. So, and he produces a new figure and holds that above the wall, and that's the figure of the philosopher. And the reflection of the philosopher now joins the other human paradigms on the cave wall. So the Platonic dialogues have this figure Socrates, who is master in all the situations, all of these conversational situations, even though his teaching is apparently that his awareness of his own ignorance rather than having the comprehensive truth. Okay.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Martin. Thanks for that, because it sort of shows that if we want a standard for the different forms of human excellence, such as bravery and inquiry and so on, we can look at these individuals such as Socrates and such as Achilles in battle and so on. So it makes it much more tangible and much more visible to have it in a human image.
Yes.
That Heidegger's essay on truth, I would have thought you might have put that on the list as well. It immediately precedes in that collection of essays.
Oh yeah, on the essence of truth. Yeah.
Divide,
Yeah.
And I was very struck by that, because we look at a gold coin, that little sentence there, and we say things about it, but it doesn't actually say what it is. And if we create an image of it and they are exactly the same, we think they're the same. I mean, it gets awfully complicated in there, but it was a fascinating little exercise, that one.
Yeah, maybe we'll bring that in later, because that is a helpful example of what he means.
Yes.
Of one of the things he means about the problem of saying what things are.
Yeah, the images and what we say about them. Yeah.
So I'm now looking at page 164 of the essay, and Heidegger says, what does the story mean? Plato himself provides the answer. He has the interpretation, immediately follow the story. And he, of course, is going to take issue with the interpretation and say it also exhibits this change in the meaning of truth, as well as its Plato's conscious intention. I'll read the second paragraph. The cave-like abode is the image for the, he translates, literally it means the seat that appears through sight, but the place of our dwelling, which in an everyday way is revealed to sight as we look around. And the everyday is one of Heidegger's almost technical terms, that we must orientate ourselves initially by our everyday understanding. And I take this to be almost irrefutable, that highly intricate scientific account of things have their place within the everyday, and they get their significance within our everyday understanding of things, rather than the other way around, that what you can't measure scientifically has no significance. I think that this is something helpful in what he's doing. Okay, so then he says, the fire in the cave, which burns above those who dwell there, is the image for the sun. The vault of the cave represents the dome of the heavens. People live under this dome, assigned to the earth and bound to it. Now, yeah, thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche has Zarathustra say, "Be true to the earth," and this is something that Heidegger also agrees with. And I want to make something of that in a moment. What surrounds and concerns them there is for them what is real. That is that which is. So he's just referring to the fact that the people take the reflections on the wall to be the beings, the things that are. In this cave-like dwelling, they feel they are in the world and at home, and here they find what they can rely on. And that's interesting because he wants to, one of Heidegger's intentions is to return people to being at home and in the world. So I'm going to make a very simplistic suggestion that can be rejected immediately, but Plato teaches that the political community is a partially open cave. It's open all the way along, but there's only a little bit of light and shadow. But there is an outside of the cave, which makes, and living in the light of that reality puts one in opposition to it. Heidegger is saying there's no outside the cave. To say that there are forms, to say that there is an outside in which you can see the beings, that is an alienation from an authentic being in the world with one's fellow human beings in a historical people. So that's my suggestion. There's no outside the cave, and the attempt to say that there are ideas and an outside alienates us from the earth and from being in the world, which means being with others.
Martin, does that depend on how you construe the analogy? Like if you take the cave to represent culture, and then, you know, as someone who's traveled a lot, I find this analogy very useful. So you leave, you know, the cave is your culture, you travel, like hence the metaphors about travel, broadening the mind and stuff. And then you come back into the cave, then obviously the people don't like being told, they don't want to forego their myths, so then they kill the person who is like that. Now, how does Heidegger square that? You know.
How do you mean with what? How does he square it?
Well, if he's saying that there's no outside the cave, well, then we're just slaves to convention and opinion.
Now, so
if that's how you take what the metaphor means, but
yeah, but there are yeah, and so then the difficulty for him is to say how he knows which set of opinions are more authentic than others, because there's no outside standard. Yes.
Yeah, it just depends on how what you take the cave analogy to represent. Like I've always taken the cave to represent culture and conventional opinions. And then when you leave the cave, you know, you travel outside the cave, you see how other people are, you get to know the world, and you come back. I don't know, that's my representation. That's how I've always considered what the cave analogy meant, that the cave was your culture. But yeah, then I don't know. I just don't see how Heidegger's interpretation can be possible. That would have to mean that all your opinions are somehow true or something. But I don't know.
Or it would mean that it's false to try and say that there are universal opinions by which you can judge each and every culture. And that is exactly what we think. When I say we, I mean, like, yeah, that's what our universities teach and so on. That's our thought now. The truth is culturally relative.
Yeah, but then, I guess there are degrees of that, aren't there? You know, if there is if there is one truth, then the varying cultures are going to have greater or lesser adherence to that.
Well, they're all going to be false to a degree.
Yeah, but then they're all going to be truer to a degree too. Yeah.
Well,
like if there's such a thing as health, like if a culture that's slonking down Coca-Cola every day or something, to take a kind of banal example, and that's not living in light of a natural truth and one that isn't or something. And
yes.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Okay, so you're saying in the case of bodily health, there is a natural standard that would apply against all different cultural practices.
Yes. I am saying.
Okay, and that's an image, and that's an argument that Plato and Aristotle constantly make, that like just as there is health of the body, isn't there a health of the psyche?
Yeah.
So isn't there a human excellence by nature, as opposed to,
like we have cultures where people live until they're 85 and others who live until they're 65 or something. So surely the one, the last man stuff aside, the one that where people are living longer are doing something naturally better. Yes.
in regards to the body, probably, yeah.
Yeah. I'm all for an easy, dumb, happy life, Martin, as you well know.
Right. But the difficulty would be, though, that the body is not the most important thing. It's the condition for living well. But living well is constituted by the beliefs you have about what's beautiful, just, noble, and so on. And if we tried, and what Nietzsche and Heidegger share is the viewpoint that if you had a global truth about those things, it would have to be, it could only consist in our common animality. There would be no interesting culture or noble culture, or the only universal you could find would be in the body.
Yeah,
that would be the end of all culture,
Brave New World, remember?
Yeah.
Maybe.
But let's not come to final conclusions yet.
Yeah. Right. Gotcha.
First paragraph, second paragraph. So this third paragraph now, there he says, on the other hand, the things that the allegory mentions as visible outside the cave are the image for what the proper being of beings consists in. This, according to Plato, is that whereby beings show up in their visible form. Plato does not regard this visible form as a mere aspect. So he's referring, as he's going to immediately say, he's referring to the fact that Plato uses these two words, eidos and ideia, as the mental intelligibility of a thing. So by visible form, he means the intelligible character of a thing, the look something presents to the mind's eye. So when you recognize this is a human being and not a tree, your mind has perceived something. And the eidos and ideia, they share the root of when I was saying before about when Socrates says see, they share the same root as the word to see, idein. But they mean, and that's a metaphor, to see with the mind's eye, not with the sensible eye. In the allegory, the things that are visible in the daylight outside the cave, where sight is free to look at everything, are a concrete illustration of the ideas. According to Plato, if people did not have these ideas in view, that is to say, the respective appearance of things, living beings, humans, numbers, gods, they would never be able to perceive this or that as a house or a tree, as a god. Now, on the one hand, I think that's a good statement, in that Plato is saying, human beings recognize what things are, and that what is not reducible to any sensuous character or any predicate of the thing. It's the thing itself as it presents itself to the mind. Now, I think in the allegory, though, I've been suggesting that there are no gods outside the cave. They're not mentioned. It refers to the sun, human beings, living things. It doesn't refer to the gods, which I assume that means they're a construction. But I think he's right to say that Plato is suggesting that from your experience that you can count on your ability to recognize what things are. And that's where number comes from. The fact that we can, in fact, at the heart of thinking is something like numbering. Like there are these many human beings in the room, and there's those many animals, and that's utterly reliable. our ability to recognize what things are. Now,
Martin,
yeah.
sorry, a question, but
Yeah.
surely we can only recognize if we are taught. Isn't this to do with education? I can't, this natural ability, I know that that's a horse and that's a number because I've been taught, otherwise I wouldn't know.
Yes,
How am I going to know
yes.
that that's a tree and that's a butterfly?
Yes, you're right that there is an aspect of teaching that goes into that. But so, you know, when you teach a child, the first time they see a cow, right, and you say cow, they very rarely call anything else but cows after that. So now we're using a particular language. The word cow has a particular, or not completely arbitrary, but relatively arbitrary sound and spelling. And it's connected in other parts of our language and through metaphor and so on. So it has a meaning that is not natural. It's got these links, and it's part of a linguistic structure that is not just a simple reflection of the natural truth of things. So we are. So this is what I meant before by saying that we're simultaneously in and outside the cave. We have this ability to receive the looks of things, and then we force them into speech, which is conventional and which we're taught. But the fact that we do so reliably identify the things before we talk about them, that I think Socrates takes as evidence for this notion of the forms being the natures of the things. And the things that matter to us are those most covered over with conventions and opinions that discolor the original character of things, especially what it means to be a human being. Is that acceptable, Deborah?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going to try and be quite a bit more selective so we can make some progress. Yeah, I will read a bit more of this paragraph though. Usually they think they see this house and that tree directly, and the same with every being. Generally, they never suspect that it is always and only in the light of the ideas that they see everything that passes so easily and familiarly for the real. According to Plato, what they presume to be exclusively and properly the real, what they can immediately see, hear, grasp, compute, always remains a mere adumbration of the idea, and consequently a shadow. Now, I'm finding this slightly in tension with my reading of the dialogue, because I don't think that, well, the artifacts aren't necessarily images of the ideas, but presumably they can be. That I think is true. Okay, so I'll just read one more sentence from this paragraph. So that which is nearest, even though it has the consistency of shadows, holds human captives day after day. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip around and read some further comments, but please interrupt. And if there's any part of these initial 5 or 6 pages of Heidegger that you want to ask about, please bring it up and we can discuss. So I'm going to go to page 165, and in the first paragraph, about 7 lines down, he says, the people in the cave are so passionately attached to their view that they are incapable of even suspecting the possibility that what they take for the real might have the consistency of mere shadows. But how could they know about shadows when they do not even want to be aware of the fire in the cave and its light, even though this fire is merely something man-made and hence should be familiar to human beings? Yeah, and I've mentioned before, say for the Greek context, Herodotus talks about how Homer and Hesiod made the most important objects of ordinary Greek experience. In contrast, the sunlight outside the cave is in no way a product of human making. So I think that's good. He's brought out well the fact that the chief underlying question is what's natural and what's an artifact or a reflection of an artifact. In its brightness, things have grown and are present. Things that have grown and are present show themselves immediately without needing adumbrations to represent them. That is, you see the forms of things. It's an image. Seeing the things outside the cave is the metaphor for seeing the character, the forms of things directly. Now, he's using that little phrase, things are present. The things that have grown and are present. The things have grown and then they pass away. And one of his suggestions is going to be that Plato takes the form of a thing and what's an ordinary term for hypostaticization? He turns it into a thing. He turns it into a static thing. So the momentary presentation of a thing, of what a thing is, he turns that into a permanent standard. And this is one of the things that Heidegger wants to suggest is where Plato goes wrong. He turns a moment in an ongoing process of illumination into a thing. Okay. In the allegory, the things that show themselves are the image for the ideas. Fair enough. But the sun in the allegory is the image for that which makes all ideas visible. It is the image for the idea of all ideas. And that's the idea of the good. Now, in the next paragraph, in the middle of it, he says, the proper dimensions of the whole image has not even come into grasp yet. The allegory recounts a series of movements rather than just reporting on the dwelling places and the conditions of people inside and outside the cave. And then he poses these questions. What are the movements? What makes them possible? From what do they derive their necessity? And what issue is at stake? And so I mentioned before, he is saying that Plato makes a temporal moment in our experience things into an atemporal form, and that's not true to our experience. And it's similar with the various levels of understanding in the cave and the movement between them. He gives more weight to the movement and less to the static understanding that derives from the movement. So the next paragraph is about the two kinds of blindness, going up outside into the light and coming back into the cave. And I'm going to go to, on page 166, to the third paragraph. And he says, and just as the physical eye must accustom itself slowly and steadily at first, either to the light or to the dark, so likewise the soul, patiently and through an appropriate series of steps, has to accustom itself to the region of beings to which it is exposed. But this process of getting accustomed requires that before all else, the soul in its entirety be turned around as regards the fundamental direction of its striving. Okay, and I think that's true, and that's derived from a phrase that Socrates uses when he says that knowledge is not what many people say it is, which is the pouring of, we would say, information, the pouring of knowledge into the psyche. It's the periagorge, the turning around of the whole soul, and that's part of the meaning of that, the cave image for Socrates, which is that people have a fundamental orientation, and very, very few people are fundamentally orientated towards the truth. And only if you had such people, and only if they educated themselves completely, would you have just rulers. But I think here Heidegger is not giving total justice to the difference between the way up and the way down. The way up occurs by nature and instantaneously. And then there's the hard work of going up and being accustomed. Whereas the going back down would have to be some kind of decision. I think they're different in character, and later on I might be able to suggest why why he wants to de-emphasize that. Okay, so I'm going to read from on page 166, the fourth paragraph down. But why does this process of getting accustomed to each region have to be slow and steady? The reason is that the turning around has to do with one's being, and thus takes place in the very ground of one's essence. This means that the normative bearing that is to result from this turning around must unfold from a relation that already sustains our essence and develop into a stable comportment. So my much more simple translation of that would be that if it's of the essence of human beings that we think and that we have, and to think is to think of things that are not simply particulars. If that's the essence of us, and we have many other aspects to us, many other passions and interests and abilities and so on, but if that's of the essence, then that comportment towards the truth would be our fundamental attunement. That would be our fundamental coming into our own, coming into what we genuinely are. So Heidegger then says, this process whereby the human essence is reoriented and accustomed to the region assigned to it at each point is the essence of what Plato calls paideia, which is the word we're translating as education. And here Heidegger refers to that phrase, the turning around of the whole soul. So again, Plato was saying that education which is genuinely in tune with our nature is one that takes us away from the community. And that's which I think is against Heidegger's inclination. Now he says, because genuine education requires the turning around of the whole soul, he says, hence paideia is essentially a movement of passage, namely from apaideusia, lack of education, into paideia. And this is going to link up with his notion of the truth. Just as lack of education and education are in tension and require effort and adjustment, so the truth is something that emerges in a contest with forgetfulness or oblivion. So we have these two alpha privileges, lack of education and education, and aletheia, the truth, with lethe, forgetfulness or oblivion.
I think there's a problem here with the word education, because you will see that in that bit that you've just been reading, he then has quite a chunk talking about the translation of paideia and what it means. He uses the for Bildung, which is a German for education, but it also means an imprint, an example, something to strive for, that you form something. It's more a formation building. And he says all that, right, in this bit. And therefore, you can follow his thinking much more easily with that word in mind than with education. Because education only means to bring forth, to elicit something from, isn't it? So, it's the Latin rather than the Greek, and that makes it very different. And I think probably the Greek is closer to the Bildung rather than education. But look, it's just language. I mean, yeah.
No, it's important, and so, okay. So my interpretation is that he, as exactly as you say, he says, Bildung means the German word, which is often translated as education, but literally means, as the translator puts in here, formation. Is it das Bild? Is the image.
Das Bild is an image.
Yes. So. And I don't know, I think that this, so he says, so therefore Bildung has these two aspects, the forming of someone
Yeah.
the way you impress a character on something.
Yeah.
And he uses this word forebuild,
Yeah.
which is
Mhm.
translates as a prototype.
Yeah, but also something to strive for. It's an example of something you want, you know, like parents or somebody, you know, they should be an example to you as to how to behave, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and in Plato, what do we have? Well, we have the image of the person who goes outside the cave. Like that's a build, right? That's an image that is meant to become an object of aspiration, but it's meant to depict a kind of knowing that is not the formation of anything except the reception of the truth. It's not a collective education. And that's what's surprising about the whole image. The first line, it says, I'm going to tell you an image of our nature in its education and lack of education, but it's about a very particular or individual possibility. It's not about the community as a whole. Whereas I think the Bildung, especially with this implication of the impression of a character or a type in a paradigm, that is more of a collective notion. Would you consider that to be?
I thought of it that way. That's not what I'm getting, though. It's a general truth about education, a Bildung, because it's a much richer concept. Right, that's all I'm saying. There's probably a lot more in that idea than there is in education, and I think in the German it maybe conveys that better.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's fair.
Martin, could I ask a question?
Please.
It goes back to what you were saying about one of Heidegger's criticisms of Plato and forms. I remember. So 100 years ago, the social scientist Weber, in one of his last lectures, said he referred to the extraordinary discovery by Plato. He calls it an extraordinary discovery, which has changed the entire world in the 2,500 years since. Talking about the idea, the form, and so when you said that Heidegger is questioning the stability of forms, do you mean by that Heidegger is saying that the ideas themselves in the way that they present are different from era to era, or so what my suggestion is that as long as human beings have existed, in other words, as long as political communities have existed where people speak to each other and do the same sorts of things like fight wars and do farming and make families and things like that, human beings are basically, for the last, I'm guessing, 100,000 years, they've always been the same in the sense that they think about things and they talk and they agree and disagree. Because my impression, you were saying that Heidegger is saying that ideas at certain periods are going to be qualitatively different from each other, and I just don't think that could be right. And I don't.
Yeah.
And I don't. Yeah. Sorry.
Just because we've just reached 8:01, so I'll just try and respond briefly, and then I'll be very happy for you to begin next time with a further development of your thought. But I recently saw for some reason, the YouTube algorithm threw up a few minutes of an anthropologist talking to a tribe that hunts orangutans, and they have no technology, no contact with modernity at all. Their conversation entirely consists of 25 different ways of saying how they'll attack the orangutans tonight. Right? So yes. So I don't think that all human communities have the same access to the same thoughts and have the same nature. So the artifacts that are held and carried back and forth and so on are so radically different. And that's what determines the character of the human life, not the fact that they're all human and have a digestive system.
Yeah. So
therefore, I'm just saying this on Heidegger's side, that which is of human significance does change so radically historically, that it looks like that's evidence for his view that there are no stable ideas.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that there was this extraordinary discovery in the 5th century BC, but people was, but 1,000 years before that and 5,000 years before that, people were still thinking and doing the same things. But it was the reflection by the Greeks that made this explicit and led to philosophy and science. And like, they're not different human beings, either mentally or bodily, obviously.
I guess I'm not sure about that, just because the occurrence of tragedy, comedy, and philosophy radically changes our self-understanding. That articulation changes what we are. Not in a sense that other people are less human, but just it's a decisive opening up of human possibilities.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say that it is, and it's of universal significance. So people have learned from the Greeks in every country on earth for the last 2,000 years, and just as there have been, say, universal discoveries in some other cultures, let's say, the discovery of this or that god in that country. So it's not a, I don't think it's a cultural peculiarity of 5th century Greeks. I think there was something happening around the world at that time. Anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, no. Well, let's continue that argument next week. And so yeah, we're on page 167, and we'll continue from there. And please bring questions, objections, passages that you find mysterious in the Heidegger essay, of which there are several, and we can discuss them. And otherwise, have a pleasant weekend. And I'll speak to you on Tuesday next week.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant, Martin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Yeah.